Welcome to the Fantasy Thinker. I'm Jared, and today I want to talk a little bit about a nonfiction book called "Rhetorics of Fantasy" by Farah Mendlesohn, and this was published in April of 2008, and it is a work of fantasy literary criticism that debates about certain structural and experiential aspects of fantasy literature, and that's a lot of funky words there. But I just want to talk about this book in the sense that it's of how it affected me and how I'm reading fantasy in the short time that since I've read this book, which was about a month or so ago, and this book did a lot to confirm a lot of things I already knew about the genre and literature in general and formatting. But it did open my eyes to a few things as well. So Mendelssohn breaks fantasy down into four essential categories, and that is, and she does warn us that categorizing things is always a dicey proposition. So this is a very loose categorization, I guess you could say, but they're fairly legitimate. I think that she breaks it down into the portal or quest fantasy, and she groups those together, and that's interesting. And then there's the immersive fantasy, and then there's the intrusive fantasy, and then there's what she calls the liminal fantasy, which is interesting to say the least. So I'm gonna focus mostly on the portal or quest fantasy because through reading this book, I found that that's probably my most my favorite one. I don't know if it's my favorite. Depends on how. I mean, I don't know. I have favorites in each category, I guess. So, so excuse my waffling. Anyways, it's interesting because she gets into she gets into different texts that I know about. She gets into Terry Brooks. She gets into David Eddings. She gets into Stephen Donaldson, of course, and those are the three big ones. But she also gets into. She also talks about China Mieville, which is very interesting. And considering this came out in 2008, I think fantasy has evolved a little bit from even that time. So there's stuff that may have defied the expectations already set down by this seminal work here. So very interesting indeed. But the the thing that I want to go through is that she talks about the Portal Quest fantasy and how this kind of fantasy, that being Lord of the Rings, is a quest fantasy. Also, she explains kind of a portal as well for the reader, because you're at first immersed into the world of the hobbits, and then you are the hobbits through this quest. And so it's interesting how she puts those into the same category. Anyways, but she says that in these kind of fantasies, the fantasy land is orientalized into the unchanging past, so that the unchanging past is what's glorified here in these kind of fantasies, and that's very interesting. So if you yeah, that unchanging past thing, it very because that's the ideal that supposedly Aragorn is going for. They don't want progress is looked at as something bad or evil in those books, especially when you get to the Scouring of the Shire later on, right? So Fantasyland is looked at in this way. But the most uh, the most interesting passage out of this book is her examination of Donaldson's Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever, because one of the things she says, which I really liked, was Donaldson writes fantasy as one long, wild discharge of energy that seems to create the landscape of the earth out of nothingness by sheer force of its brilliance. I thought that was a great line, actually, and very accurate, because that is how good Donaldson's writing is in those books. Um, and but there's one passage. Let me see here. I'm trying to find it. Ah, there is one passage which really, because the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant are a portal fantasy. Thomas Covenant goes through a transformation or some kind of somehow he travels to the land, and but he's called the Unbeliever, and so Donaldson uses unbelief as the or belief, depending on how it goes, as the controlling. She says the controlling paradigm for the whole sequence of novels here. And so this is a very interesting. So the narrative of the entire trilogy falls into three discrete parts, each matched to a book and predicated on the current value of Covenant's unbelief as its importance to him wanes. So those of you familiar with the trilogy, in Lord Fowl's Bane, Covenant's rejection, and this is spoilers if you haven't read these yet, but you should read these books if you are a fantasy fan, because they are classic and they are seminal to the genre. Anyways, in Lord Fowl's Bane, Covenant's rejection of the land is total, so the narrative does not diverge at all from his perception in any way. In the second book, The Illith War, his system of unbelief begins to erode, and fully 1/3 of the events of the land are narrated from Hyle Troy's point of view in Covenant's absence. So that's the erosion of the unbelief. And then finally, in The Power that Preserves, the third book, the narrative in the land begins without Covenant present and separates into 3 tracks as Covenant's unbelief becomes a moot point. And he ceases to dispute with himself the land's reality or unreality. He just stops thinking about it that way. The evolving alteration of perspectives with these 3 books within the text confirms from the reader, exterior understanding the reality of the land, and concomitantly denies Covenant's beginning premise of dream. And that's how that trilogy brilliantly plays with the format of the portal fantasy. And I thought that was very well. That was very well said, I thought, and I really liked that. I really liked that how she used Donaldson's writing as an example in this book. So then she goes on to the other types of immersion fantasy and intrusion fantasy. How immersion fantasy is when you are totally, of course, immersed into the world. You are there, and all the players and the characters in the setting work as if the world is there, has always been there, is real. There's no introduction to the world. There's no getting into the world and having to be told what the world is and is about. You are there, you're immersed. And I mean, I would consider Mendlesohn immersion fantasy from that point of view. You're not explained how things work. You got to figure it out as you're reading, because all the characters, they already know how the world works, so they're not going to sit there and explain it to each other. So that's the immersive fantasy part of it. And then you have the intrusive fantasy, which I think kind of speaks for itself. That's it's about the approach of the fantastic, the intrusion of the fantastic, rather than the arrival or what have you. It's you know it's sometimes she says in here that the intrusive fantasy is actually a bit of a letdown because it marks the end of an adventure rather than the beginning. But I mean, I guess that would depends on how you look at it. Uh, and so that's interesting. And then she gets into something called liminal fantasy, and there's a lot of I don't know. Liminal fantasy. The definition for that is vague. It's delusion of it's something about the delusion. The delusion of Laura is no more or less fanciful than the illusion of fairy. This is in reference to Merle's. What's that book called? I forget what the book calls, but it's Luddimus. That's it. I'm sorry. All right, so Luddimus is the name of the book, and this is where the liminal fantasy seems to be, where these rules are very vague and bendful. I don't know. I guess you could also say that to me, the category of magical realism might fall into this liminal category. Unfortunately, anyone who writes magical realism would be adverse to wanting to be categorized as fantasy. I don't know why. It doesn't make sense to me. But anyway, these are all the 4 categories that this book gets into. And it's really fascinating stuff. I thought she really went way too deep in the weeds when it came to the liminal parts. She seemed to spend a lot of time on that one, and a lot of time not reviewing, but actually talking about text in real depth, that over and over again, that I just didn't really feel like I needed when I was reading. And I kind of was like, all right, I just want to get through those parts. I really dug some of the earlier stuff with the portal and quest stuff, and the immersive fantasy, and somewhat the intrusion. But overall, those parts of the books were really fascinating to me, and I enjoyed reading them. So it was despite the vague definitions of the liminal fantasy and stuff like that, I think it's a really important book to just reference, read through, get some good ideas about the fantasy that you're reading, and so you can self-categorize and bring some sense of awareness to your own reading, and really just I think it adds to the enjoyment myself. Maybe some folks wouldn't want that type of knowledge intruding on their fantasy. I don't know. To me, it enhances all my reading, and when I read something like this. So there you have it. Rhetorics of Fantasy by Farah Mendlesohn. I think it's a really like I said, it says seminal work in the Wikipedia thing, but I think it's pretty important. So if you like this kind of stuff, then you're definitely gonna want to check out this nonfiction work. And so, even though it's nonfiction, hey, it's all about the fantasy, right? That's all for now. Be good to each other, and thank you.